why nations like Nepal fail, and how they recover. Imagine this: the streets of Kathmandu filled with thousands of young faces, some still in their school uniforms, some waving placards, some chanting slogans with fiery energy. They're not just protesting a social media ban or some random government law. No. What you are seeing is the boiling frustration of an entire generation. Water cannons blast through the crowds, tear gas fills the air, and gunshots echo. By nightfall, dozens are dead, hundreds injured. The army rolls in, and a curfew is slapped across the capital. This is not just about one law, one protest, or even one generation. It's the story of why nations like Nepal fall into cycles of failure, instability, and chaos. And it's also the story of whether they can rise again. Now, to understand this, we need to go beyond just the headlines. Protests, curfews, and corruption scandals are only the surface. Beneath that, there are deeper fault lines, historical, political, economic, and even global power games that keep dragging countries like Nepal back into instability. In today's video, we're going to uncover why small nations like Nepal fail repeatedly, who benefits from this failure, and what realistic steps they can take to recover and rebuild a stable, prosperous future. So buckle up. This isn't just about Nepal. It's about a pattern that is played out across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe for decades. Let's start with the very basics. What exactly does it mean for a nation to fail? Nation failure. A failed nation is not just one where people protest or where leaders are corrupt. No, the definition goes deeper. A failed state, or failing nation, is one where the government cannot deliver three essential things: security and stability, economic opportunity, and fair governance and justice. Think of it like a three-legged stool. If even one leg breaks, the whole stool collapses. And in the case of Nepal, all three legs have been weak, unstable, and at times completely shattered. On paper, Nepal has everything: rich culture, majestic Himalayas, huge tourism potential, a strategic location between India and China. But in reality, Nepal struggles with poverty, corruption, brain drain, and political instability. Now you might ask, why is this happening? Why does a nation that has so much potential keep slipping back into crisis after crisis? Let's dive into the first reason: leadership and governance. Leadership crisis. If you look at Nepal's politics over the last few decades, you will notice the same names repeating like a broken record. The same leaders, often in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, recycling themselves through different parties and governments. These leaders often come to power with grand promises of reform, but once in office, the cycle of corruption, nepotism, and mismanagement continues. And this is not unique to Nepal. You see the same trend in many failing nations. Leaders treat the state as their personal property. Politics becomes a family business. The children of powerful politicians inherit the party, the influence, the money, and eventually the government posts. The idea of fresh leadership is killed before it can even be born. This creates frustration among the youth, the very group that should be driving the nation's growth. Imagine being 22 years old in Nepal, graduating with a degree, but realizing there are no jobs, no opportunities, and no future unless you either leave the country or join the corrupt system. That hopelessness is what drives protests. That hopelessness is what makes the youth take to the streets, even if it risks their lives. And then, when governments try to silence them by banning social media, censoring voices, or using violence, the anger multiplies. But here's the twist. It's not just about Nepal's internal failures. Every time a small nation collapses into chaos, there's always a bigger player lurking in the shadows. foreign-funded NGOs, international organizations, and even global powers ready to pour money, fund protests, and push their preferred leaders. History is filled with examples. Serbia's bulldozer revolution, Georgia's Rose Revolution, Ukraine's Orange Revolution, the Arab Spring in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. More recently, Sri Lanka's crisis and the forced ouster of leaders in Bangladesh. And now the same pattern is being seen in Nepal. Protests that appear spontaneous often have well-organized NGOs behind them, with links to Western donors or global foundations. Money flows in, leaders are chosen, narratives are built, and the final goal is always the same: to install a government that serves the interests of bigger powers, not the local people. Nepal's geographical position makes it even more valuable. Sandwiched between two giants, India and China, Nepal becomes the perfect chessboard for the US, the West, and even regional powers to play their games. Keeping Nepal unstable gives them leverage to watch, influence, and even manipulate both India and China. So here's the big picture so far. Nepal fails because of corrupt leadership, lack of opportunities for its youth, and constant external interference. But that still leaves us with the most important question. If so many nations face the same problem, how do they recover? That's where we're headed next. Deeper causes of failure. Economic fragility. One of the biggest reasons nations like Nepal fail is economic fragility. To put it simply, the economy is too weak to support its people. More than 80% of Nepal's workforce is stuck in informal, low-paying jobs, the kind of work where there are no benefits, no protections, and no real chance to move up. Agriculture still employs the majority, but it's outdated, under-mechanized, and vulnerable to natural disasters. Then there's unemployment. Every year, tens of thousands of young Nepalis graduate from schools and colleges, but there aren't enough jobs waiting for them. What happens next? They migrate. You'll find Nepali workers in the Middle East, Malaysia, South Korea, India, as laborers, drivers, construction workers, domestic helpers. The money they send home in remittances is massive. In fact, remittances account for nearly a quarter of Nepal's GDP.
But here's the catch. This creates a dangerous dependency. The government doesn't feel the pressure to create jobs inside Nepal because the remittances are keeping the economy alive. Families survive, foreign reserves stay afloat, and politicians keep making empty promises. But underneath, the country is hollowing out. Its brightest, youngest, most energetic people are leaving, while those who remain are trapped in stagnation. Corruption and nepotism. Now let's talk about corruption. This is not just about a few politicians taking bribes. In Nepal, corruption has seeped into the DNA of the system. Land scams, fake refugee scams, inflated procurement contracts, there's a long list. For example, imagine the government buying weapons or medical equipment at 4 times the real price, just so a few officials can pocket millions in commissions. Or think about powerful families who own construction companies, banks, and even NGOs who then use politics to feed their businesses. In fact, many Nepalese joke that politics in their country is less about public service and more about family inheritance. If your father was a minister, you'll likely become one too. This creates a dangerous cycle where power is recycled within a tiny elite circle while ordinary citizens remain powerless. And corruption is not just stealing money, it destroys trust. People lose faith in democracy when they see the same corrupt figures return to power again and again. That's when citizens start asking themselves, is the system even worth saving? Inequality and social frustration. Alongside corruption comes inequality. Walk through the streets of Kathmandu and you'll see luxury cars, mansions, and children of politicians posting photos from Europe or America. And just a few blocks away, you'll see families living in slums, struggling to afford food. This glaring inequality breeds resentment. Social media only magnifies it. Young people scroll through Instagram, seeing Nepo kids flaunting luxury brands, foreign degrees, and business empires, all while they can't find a job that pays more than a few dollars a day. When the government then tries to silence social media, the anger explodes. Because for the youth, Facebook and Instagram are not just apps. They're their voice, their tool to expose corruption, their only platform to challenge the elite. Blocking it feels like blocking democracy itself. Geopolitical chessboard. But we cannot talk about Nepal's struggles without looking at its geography. Nepal is small, but its location is massive. It sits right between India and China, two rising giants with their own rivalry. For both countries, Nepal is not just a neighbor, it's a strategic buffer. And then comes the United States. Washington doesn't see Nepal as a rich prize by itself, but as a pressure point. If America can influence Nepal, it gains a listening post right between India and China. That's why so many protests, NGOs, and movements in Nepal end up with foreign fingerprints. Take the example of other regions. The US and Western-backed NGOs were heavily involved in revolutions in Eastern Europe, in the Arab Spring, and even in South Asia. Why would Nepal be any different? Protests that appear organic often have a pattern: youth mobilization, NGO coordination, foreign funding, and a new leader being groomed in the background. In Nepal's case, organizations like Hami Nepal began as earthquake relief groups, but later became platforms for political mobilization. Behind them, money from business tycoons, foreign donors, and even controversial figures flowed in. For ordinary citizens, this creates a tragic irony. They are genuinely fighting against corruption and injustice, but in the process, their anger is sometimes hijacked by external players who want to install their own puppets in power. Cycle of instability. Put all of this together, and you see a vicious cycle. Weak economy, unemployment, and migration. Corruption, no faith in government. Inequality, rising frustration. External interference, protests turned into political coups. Political instability, no stable policies for growth, back to weak economy again. This is why Nepal, despite decades of democracy, revolutions, and new constitutions, still struggles to escape the shadow of failure. But here's the good news. History also shows that countries can break this cycle. Nations that were once labeled failed have managed to turn around. The question is, how? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next section, the roadmap of recovery. What can Nepal learn from other nations? And what steps can actually transform a fragile state into a thriving one? The recovery roadmap. The first step, leadership renewal. Every nation that has recovered from chronic instability began with one thing: fresh leadership. Not just a new face in politics, but an actual generational shift. For Nepal, this means moving beyond the same recycled names who have clung to power for decades. Look at countries like Georgia after its Rose Revolution, or Indonesia after the fall of Suharto. Change began not because the old guard suddenly became honest, but because new leaders, often from a younger generation, stepped in with the backing of people hungry for reform. In Nepal, the youth are already at the center of protests, but the challenge is converting street energy into institutional power. Marching in Kathmandu can make headlines, but lasting recovery requires political organization, policy vision, and the ability to govern responsibly. If young activists, students, and reform-minded leaders can move from protest movements to serious political platforms, they can start breaking the old cycle. Strengthening institutions, not personalities. Here's the brutal truth. No nation can recover if everything depends on one charismatic leader. Why? Because once that leader is gone, the system collapses back into chaos. The secret is building strong institutions, independent courts, professional bureaucracies, accountable police forces, and transparent anti-corruption bodies. These are boring compared to fiery speeches or viral protests, but they are what keep a nation standing when leaders come and go. Nepal needs to invest in institutions that can check power, investigate corruption, and enforce laws without political interference. Imagine an anti-corruption body that can actually prosecute powerful families, or a court system where cases don't drag on for decades. That's when people start believing again in the system.
Economic reforms and jobs. But institutions alone won't feed people. Recovery also demands economic reforms that create real opportunities inside the country. One clear path for Nepal is tourism. The Himalayas are a global brand, yet tourism infrastructure is underdeveloped. Better roads, safer airports, cleaner cities, and professional training for hospitality workers could multiply tourism revenues. Another path is hydropower. Nepal has massive water resources and the potential to export electricity to both India and China. But corruption, red tape, and political instability keep delaying projects. If Nepal can cut the bureaucracy and attract clean investment, it could become an energy hub. And of course, entrepreneurship. Instead of depending forever on remittances, the government should support startups, small businesses, and digital industries. With the rise of remote work, Nepali youth could tap into global markets without leaving the country, if they have internet access, training, and support. Curbing the brain drain. But let's be real, none of this works if the brightest minds keep leaving. Every year, Nepal loses tens of thousands of young workers to foreign labor markets. That's like draining the fuel out of a car while expecting it to drive forward. To recover, Nepal must create incentives for its people to stay. Better wages, fair recruitment, business opportunities, and most importantly, dignity at home. When young Nepalis feel that they don't need to bribe someone just to get a government job, or that they can actually build a career without leaving for Dubai or Malaysia, the cycle begins to shift. Fighting corruption at the root. This might sound obvious, but it's the toughest part. Corruption in Nepal is not just an occasional scandal, it's systemic. To fight it, you need both top-down reform and bottom-up pressure. Top-down means clear laws, transparency in contracts, and institutions that punish the guilty. Bottom-up means citizens refusing to normalize bribes, refusing to vote for corrupt leaders just because they hand out freebies during elections. And here's where social media can become a powerful ally. Remember, governments may try to silence it, but platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are tools that young people use to hold the elite accountable. Exposing Nepo kids flaunting wealth, calling out shady deals, spreading awareness, these are digital weapons in the fight against corruption. Learning from other nations. Now, let's zoom out. Has any country ever been in Nepal's position and actually recovered? The answer is yes. Rwanda. After a devastating genocide in 1994, Rwanda was considered a failed state. But by focusing on strong institutions, zero tolerance for corruption, and a clear economic vision, Rwanda transformed itself into one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. Vietnam, once torn apart by war and poverty, restructured its economy, opened up to foreign investment, and built industries that created jobs at home. Estonia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia was poor and unstable, but it invested in digital governance, education, and transparency. Today, it's a global leader in e-government and tech innovation. Nepal can take inspiration from these examples. The common thread is not perfection, but a commitment to break the old habits and focus on stability, transparency, and opportunity. Balancing global powers. Here's another reality. Nepal cannot escape geopolitics. Being between India and China means you will always be pulled from both sides. Add the United States into the mix, and Nepal becomes a chessboard for superpower rivalry. The key to recovery is balance. Nepal must learn to engage with all powers, India, China, the US, but without becoming dependent on any single one. That means transparent deals, not secret backdoor agreements. It means prioritizing national interest, not foreign agendas. For example, if China offers infrastructure loans, Nepal must ensure the terms don't lead to debt traps. If the US pushes for military cooperation, Nepal must weigh whether it serves its sovereignty. If India seeks closer ties, Nepal must make sure the partnership is balanced, not exploitative. In other words, Nepal must master the art of saying yes, but on our terms. And finally, the role of youth and civil society. Finally, we return to the real drivers of recovery, the people, especially the youth. In Nepal, more than half the population is under 30. This is not a burden, it's a weapon. A young, educated, frustrated generation is exactly what can break the old cycle. But here's the challenge. Energy without direction fizzles out. To recover, the youth must channel their frustration into constructive power. Not just protests, but political participation. Not just exposing corruption, but proposing reforms. Not just leaving the country, but staying and building. Civil society, NGOs, and independent media also have a role, but they must remain genuinely independent, not foreign puppets. Their mission should be to empower citizens, not to serve external masters. So, can Nepal recover? Yes, but recovery is not automatic. It requires courage to break old habits, discipline to build institutions, and wisdom to balance global powers. But the bigger question remains. Will Nepal actually choose that path, or will it remain stuck in the endless cycle of failure, protests, and instability? Let's wrap it all up in the conclusion. At the end of the day, Nepal's story is not just about one protest, one ban, or one government. It's about the deeper question. Why do nations fail? And the answer is rarely simple. It's a mix of weak institutions, corrupt leadership, economic fragility, and the invisible hands of global powers. But failure is not destiny. History shows that even the most fragile nations can recover if they make the hard choices. Replace old leaders with new ones, build strong institutions instead of relying on personalities, fight corruption at the root, create jobs for the youth, and balance foreign relations without becoming anyone's puppet. The youth of Nepal have already shown their courage. They've taken to the streets, risked their lives, and demanded change. The real test is whether they can turn that energy into something lasting, something that rewrites the nation's story. Because in the end, nations don't recover through foreign aid or international deals. They recover when their own people decide, enough is enough. Nepal stands at that crossroads right now, and the question for its people is simple. Will they repeat the same cycle of failure, or will they finally choose the harder, braver road to recovery?